welcome you and thank you for attending today's MPC Guest Author Series event with Okey and Ndibe. Before we get to the main event, I want to thank a few people who helped to make these events possible, let you know who we owe gratitude to for this happening. First of all, the series itself is supported by a number of entities, including MPC's own Creative Writing Program, English Department, and Humanities Division. Also, we owe thanks to the MPC Foundation and to the Monterey County Weekly, and no small thanks to the Arts Council for Monterey County, who also supports our bringing in guest authors. Individuals I need to thank include the Humanities Division Chair, Diane Boynton, and the Office Manager, Michelle Brock. I want to thank Jeanette Haxton of our Public Information Office. I want to thank Alicia Cadriel, who helps to schedule facilities and venues for us. And last but not least, I want to thank Rosa Arroyo, who is no longer with the Humanities Division, but who in the past has been indispensable to these, as it taught me a thing or two that I now do on my own, but she used to hold my hand. That said, I want to say a few things about our guest author today and then turn the floor over to him because you're not here to see me. Okey Ndibe has written 2 novels, Arrow of Time and Foreign Gods, Inc. He'll be reading from Foreign Gods, Inc. for us today a little bit and then talking about story, the importance of story. He's also won awards for his essays, which often include political commentary on events and figures in his native Nigeria. He's taught at a number of illustrious higher education institutions, most recently Brown University. His personal brilliance is manifest in the fact that he is now touring California. When you read Okey Ndibe's work, you're in the hands of a gifted storyteller. Foreign Gods Incorporated, which I read most recently, takes you on a journey you haven't been on before. And it's a darkly comic, profoundly insightful novel of the experiences of an emigre to the United States who finds his destiny something other than he expected it to be, and who ultimately returns to Nigeria to commit a crime against his village, against his former beliefs. It's not light material, but in Okey's hands, it becomes a story that both makes you laugh and often cringe at what human beings are capable of doing. I think it's well worth your read, as is Arrow of Time, both of which, incidentally, are available in the foyer when we're done here. If you'd like to have them signed by the author, we'll be glad to do that for you. I don't think I'm going to take up much more of your time, except to say that I am profoundly grateful to Okey for joining us here today. He is, as I said, touring California, came here from most recently San Francisco, where he spoke at 1,800 bookstores and 12 universities. He's been doing it too well, let me tell you. Anything to stay off the East Coast. But I'm very, very grateful that he made space in his itinerary for us. And I know that you're going to enjoy this day. When he's done with his reading, his presentation, there will be an open question and answer session, followed by book signing, and I urge you to take advantage of all these opportunities to interact with our guest authors. So, with nothing further from me, I cede the floor to our guest author. Please join me in welcoming Okey Ndibe.
Good afternoon. It's all right.
Hello.
It's all right. I usually get this kind of response from my American audiences. But I'm going to tell you what's at stake. Okay? In my culture, you can't begin to address any audience at all without offering salutation. And if the audience doesn't greet you back, it will be their very silent and polite way of saying to you, take a half. So now that you know what's at stake, right? The difference between, okay, we want to hear your stories, or we want you to leave the room quickly. So let me say again, good afternoon. Good afternoon. This is much better. Thank you very much. This is, this is such a delight, okay? To cheat on my wife by living cold, snowy Connecticut and leaving her to plow the snow along our side. And I've been traveling in such great weather. And the strange thing is I don't feel a bit guilty about it. You know. But she's told me that I have to pay once I get home. So this is what I propose to do. I've received a really generous introduction. But I also like to introduce myself by the stories that I tell. All right? And I tell my students, every class that I teach, I begin the class by having every student in class tell a story, personal story about themselves. And I tell my students that the reason I require that they tell stories is that if you have a voice, the having of a voice in any community, for me, represents the deepest form of citizenship in that community. So to be a citizen in this room is to have a voice, okay? And so, like I said, there is no better voice to have than to have the power and the permission which you give to yourself to tell a story or to tell stories about yourself. So we're going to start from the personal, and then we're going to open it up into the social, if you don't mind, right? So let me tell you one or two personal stories about me. I'm going to tell you a story about my name. Okay? Have you ever met somebody named Okey before? Anybody? There's no Nigerian here, right? Is there any Nigerians in this room? No? If there were Nigerians, I'm sure that some hands will go up because Okey is a fairly common name in my part of Nigeria. Nigeria happens to be, can you hear me by the way? Everybody, can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. So Nigeria happens to be the most populous country, black country in Africa, in the world actually. The most populous country in Africa, and the greatest population of black people in the world is Nigeria. Which country has the second largest population of black people? In the world? The United States. Brazil. Brazil. Which country has the third largest? We are there. Okay, this country. Good. So, so as long as I lived in Nigeria, my name was as normal a name as possible. Then I arrived in America to find that my name became a source of hilarity. And so one day I met a graduate student at the University of Massachusetts. I lived in Amherst, Mass at the time. So when we shook hands and I said my name is Okey, this guy began to laugh. And for about 10 minutes, he couldn't control himself. He just kept laughing and laughing. Then finally he said to me, you won't believe what happened yesterday. I said, tell me. So he told me that he'd been to Stop and Shop, a grocery store, and he was pushing his trolley down an aisle. Americans say can't, right? I speak English. So he was pushing his trolley down an aisle. In the opposite direction came a woman. As they passed each other, it was in December, and it had snowed quite heavily, so there were banks of snow everywhere you looked. So the woman said to him, how do you like the snow? This guy began to protest that he didn't like snow at all, that he liked it warm and dry. The woman said, wow, you have an accent. Where are you from? He said, Botswana. The woman said, is that in Africa? He said, yes. The woman said, are you okay? He said, yes. And so she stopped and began to talk to him with great interest. And he said they must have talked for about 15 minutes. And suddenly she said to him, I can't believe you are okay. And the guy said, is there anything about me that suggests I'm not okay? And she said to him, no, it's just that I've heard so many stories about you. He said, you have? She said, yeah. He said, what kind of story? The woman said, well, I hear that you are in town to set up an international magazine. How many of you have read Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart? Yeah? It's the most widely read novel in history by any African. It's the most widely translated novel by any African into 60-something languages. About 15 million copies sold. Chinua Achebe had invited me to this country to set up an international magazine called African Commentary. So that's why I left my career in Nigeria as an editor of a weekly news magazine to come to this country. So this woman said, I hear you're in town to edit this international magazine. And the guy said, that's not true. I'm a graduate student. And then the woman said, but you told me you were okay. And the guy said, yes, I'm fine. At which point the woman said, no, there's actually somebody in town whose name is Okay. So I thought I was meeting him. So he said the woman left, and he left, and he was very upset. He felt that what had happened was that the woman wanted to pick him up. And he said he wanted to be picked up. But somehow that the woman had changed her mind midway through their interaction and came up with this silly story about somebody named Okay. So the very next day, he met me. That's why when I extended my hand and said, my name is Okay, he couldn't stop himself from laughing. Now, since that story went over well, I'm going to tell you another Okay story. So in 2009, I was invited to Norway for a conference. I was invited because in 2006, I had been part of a conference in Sweden, sponsored by the Nordic Africa Institute in Uppsala. And I had co-edited a collection of the contributions that were made at this conference with a Zimbabwean novelist, writer, Chinderai Hove. So the book had just been published in 2009 and was going to be launched at a conference called the Africa Days Conference in Trondheim, Norway. So my minder at the Nordic Africa Institute told me, because they paid my way to go to Norway, told me that her flight would arrive an hour before mine, and that she was going to wait for me until I came into Trondheim from Oslo. And then we'll take a bus together to the hotel. But she said to me, in the event that you arrive and you can't see me because my flight ran late, just leave the airport building, look to your right and you're going to see a bus. You pay 60 kron, and then they'll drop you. She told me where to stop. So I arrived at the airport, made a quick trip round at the arrival lounge. Nobody claimed me. So I took it that the woman was running late. So I went out, paid my way, and arrived at the hotel. Several weeks after the conference, this woman called me or wrote to me and said, okay, there is something I want to discuss with you that I want to tell you over the phone. Could you send your telephone number? So I sent her my number. So she told me that what had happened was that she was indeed at the airport when my flight arrived. As soon as the arrival of my flight was announced, she ran into the bathroom to spruce up. She was there when I came and made the rounds and nobody claimed me, so I took it that she was running late, so I took a bus and left for the hotel. She came out and she didn't see me, so she assumed that I had missed my connecting flight. So she decided to wait for the next flight from Oslo. That next flight came, and there was one black person on the flight. So she walked up to him and said, are you okay? The guy said yes. And she said, did you miss your connecting flight from Oslo? He said yes. And she said, okay, I'm sorry. Get your luggage and let's go. So the guy picked up his luggage. She paid for him on the bus, and the bus left. She said she'd been told by those who met me when I came to Sweden in Uppsala that I love to tell stories. But she said this guy was particularly quiet, almost self-effacing. But she took it that he was upset because he was tired, he missed his flight and so on. So she kept talking to him, but he stayed in his shell. Finally, they got to the bus stop and she said, this is where we get off. And he got off with her. They walked into the hotel lobby, and she, speaking in Norwegian, said to them, this is my name, check me in. So they checked her in. And then she said, check Okey in. And the hotel said, Okey already checked in. And the woman said, impossible, I have Okey with me. And they said, ma'am, we have on our computer screen that Okey already checked in. So she said, I want to see the manager. So they summoned the manager. She spoke to him in Norwegian, and said, look, I brought Okey, who is our guest for this conference. They are refusing to check him in. He checked their computer and he said, Okey checked in already. So now in anger, she turned to this guy and said, please explain to them that your name is Okey. The guy said, that's not my name. And so she began to apologize to him, because the guy was coming to the same conference, but he was staying in a totally different hotel. She actually brought him to this hotel, and she wanted him to check in. And she said that the hotel staff began to look at her with suspicion. That it was almost as if they suspected that she didn't know that I was coming in, and she wanted to sneak in a guy into my room, and they caught her at it. So she said that the next day, that she brought the same guy, because the guy was now looking at her suspiciously as well. So she told me that the day my book was launched, she actually brought the guy and introduced him to say, this is the guy who is okay. So this is the guy I thought was you yesterday. So it's a great boon to have a name that generates stories for you. And a name that enables you to have fun. So one of the games that I play with my American friends sometimes is when I meet people, what's your name? Now, if I met Rebecca and she said, my name is Rebecca, I'll say, okay. Now, Rebecca wouldn't know that I've introduced myself. So a lot of Americans will say to me, Rebecca again, and I'll say, okay. And then they'll say, my name is Rebecca, what's your name? Which point I'll say, my name is okay. And they'll say, oh, that's okay, that's all right. Now, I've been asked to talk about stories. How many hours do we have? Okay. You know that I strategically did not ask for how long I was to speak. I come from a culture that is constitutionally incapable of brevity. So I love it when I've not been given restriction as to how long to speak, because then I assume that I've been invited to speak and I start speaking. All right? But I'm going to be nice today because we'll have questions to ask and we'll have books to sign. So I'm going to, make it only an hour and a half. Some people have dinner plans, right? All right. So here I was as a child growing up. And I was particularly lucky, even though I didn't know it at the time. I was lucky because we didn't have this equipment that you call what? Television. Good. Because we didn't have television, every night after dinner, we, the children, expected to be thrilled, to be entertained by either my father or my mother, or some uncle or aunt, or some older cousin. And they entertained us by telling us a folk tale, or two, if we were lucky, at night, which we were. And these folk tales just enchanted us. They introduced us to not only thrilling stories, but they became forms of shaping our moral outlook. So folk tales in my culture functioned to answer questions. Why is it questions? Why does a tortoise have shells that are broken, that are in fragments? So adults will tell you a story that explains why that is. But the stories were also for just sheer delectation. They were great stories, great entertainment. But more crucially, these stories became an instrument, as happened in traditional African societies, for the moral formation of young kids. Right? So I'm going to start today, as if I've not started, by telling you one of the folk tales that I was told growing up as a child. Then we'll go from there. Usually when an adult is to tell us a story, the adult says in Igbo, which means I have a story to tell you. And as the children will say, which means tell us that story, let it be entertaining. We're going to be attentive to hear the story that you've got to tell. Now, because you can't speak Igbo, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to say story time, and all of you are going to respond story time. All right? So story time.
Story time.
Half of us are sleeping. Story time.
Story time.
That's much better. So once upon a time, there was great famine in the land of the animals. This famine came about because there was a great quarrel between the sky and the earth. And the sky withheld rain for 7 years. And so the earth was hard to till, impossible to till. And so all the plants were dead, and the animals did not have food, and lots of them were malnourished and died. The only animals that had access to food were birds. And birds had access to food because they had friends who lived way up in the sky. And so once a week, the birds would have a convocation. And after the meeting, they would fly off to the sky, where their friends in the sky would give them a smorgasbord of meals. Now, one day came, and the birds were meeting prior to their departure to the sky. They tortoise waddled to their midst and said to them, "Friends, what are you talking about?" And they said, "We're meeting as we usually do before we go to the sky for a feast." Tortoise said to them, "Why don't you take me with you?" The bird said, "We'll love to take you. The only problem is, what? You can't fly." Now, in my culture, the tortoise is a wily animal. So the tortoise said, "I have a solution. If each of you would lend me a feather, then I'll be able to fly just like the rest of you." And the birds were generous. So each bird would use his beak to pull the feather, and the feather was glued onto the tortoise's shell. At the end of it, the tortoise flapped and flapped, was able to rise in the air. And so they began the journey to the sky. They got to the top of the Iroko tree, which again in my culture is the highest tree in the firmament. And tortoise said, "Why don't we perch for a minute? There's some new game that I want to introduce to you." So all the birds agreed, because they knew that tortoise was wise, and tortoise was wily and cunning. They're very clever. They knew that tortoise would always come up with very exciting and entertaining games. So when they perched, tortoise said to them, "There's a new game in town that you don't know about. And that game is that people now take great, flamboyant, inflated names. So why don't we each take these entertaining names?" And so the birds began to adopt new names. And so one said, "I'm the conqueror of the sky." Another one said, "I'm the celestial champion." So they chose all these very flamboyant names. And then they said to tortoise, "What's your name?" And tortoise had a wry smile, and he said to them, "My name is all of you." And so the birds found that funny, and they all giggled and continued their trip to the sky. And when they got there, all kinds of food were presented for them. All right? What's your favorite food? Strawberries were there. Yours? Chocolates. Lots of chocolates. Believe me. Yours? Banana? Or you needed to see how much banana was there. You? Pizza. Lots and lots. All kinds. So all these foods were there. And the birds were in particularly hungry mood. So they were about to fall to and eat. The tortoise said to them, wait a minute. Let's find out from our hosts who they have provided the food for. And so the host said, the food is for all of you. And so tortoise turned to the birds and said, see, I suspected that the food was for me. My name is all of you. So he began to eat the food alone, and he had brought some bags and he was stuffing some in the bags and so on and so forth. As he ate, out of a sense of mischief, he would just drop some crumbs on the floor. The birds would fight over the crumbs. Of course, the birds were angry after tortoise had stuffed himself with all the food and bagged the rest of it. So in anger, each bird went up to tortoise and said, you have been mean. I want my feather back right now. Tortoise said, hey, why not wait when we return? I'll give you back your feather. They said, no, we want it now. So they would use their beaks to pull their feather from tortoise. When they were done, they left to go back to earth. As they were leaving, tortoise cried out in a very plaintive voice. And so two of the birds came back. Tortoise said to them, please, could you do me a favor? And the bird said, you've not been nice. Why would we do you this favor? And tortoise said, just because I know you are nice, and I didn't mean to be greedy. Next time I won't be greedy. The bird said, no, there won't be a next time. Anyway, so tortoise begged them. And he said, when you get back to home, could you go to my wife and tell my wife, as I said, she should bring out all the pillows and all the balloons and all the leaves and all the soft things in the house and spread them out in front of my compound, because I'll have to jump from the sky so that I'll fall on this soft drop. And so the bird said, we don't owe you this favor, but because we're nice, we're going to do it for you. So when they came back, they went to tortoise's wife. They gave her the message that your husband said you should bring out all the rocks, and all the wood and all the steel in the house. And you should spread it out for him. And so she did as she'd been told. So from way up in the sky, tortoise shouted down to his wife, have you done what I asked you to do? She could barely hear him, but she said, yes. And he could barely hear her. But he then jumped. And so for a long time he was tumbling and tumbling and tumbling through the space, and boom! He fell on this hardness. And so tortoise's shell was broken into little pieces. And his wife had to send to a far country where there lived the best doctor in the world, the best healer. And the healer came and used a special kind of glue to put tortoise's shell together again. So that is why tortoise's shell is broken into little fragments. Story time?
Story time.
That's the end of that story. Now, typically, after we were told these stories, and tortoise was a central character in many of these stories, after we were told the stories, the adults would then say to us, what have you learned from that story? And so when my kids were young and in elementary school, I used to go into the American classroom and tell them some of these stories. I told this particular story, and I said to the kids, what have you learned? And some of them said, well, it's not good to be greedy, it's not good to deceive people, and so on and so forth. It's not good to be too trusting. But then one kid one day gave an answer that has stayed with me. And that answer showed me that somebody has a promising career on Wall Street. This kid was anxious to say something, and I knew that he had an original response about what lessons he learned. So when I pointed to him, he stood up and said, next time, tortoise should pack a parachute. I said, that's a great Wall Street, great American answer. Do not be greedy, just pack a parachute. But so, these were the storytelling tradition. This was the storytelling tradition out of which I sprung. This was the environment of stories that shaped me, informed my moral formation, but also informed my evolution as a writer. And so I came to this country at the invitation of the Nigerian writer Ndibe to set up an international magazine. 2.5 years later, despite the fact that the magazine had got great critical acclaim, was chosen by the Library Journal as the best news feature magazine out in this country in 1989, and one of the best 16 out of 584 magazines that came out in this country, publications, magazines and newspapers. The magazine could not sustain itself because we did not get advertising. The magazine was funded from the private pockets of writers like Ndibe, academics like him, and so they didn't have very deep pockets. And yet, when we went to New York to meet with advertising agencies to ask for advertising support, they took one look at us and they said, your magazine is too serious. They'll say, black people don't read serious magazines. And then they would advise us to go and do a magazine like Essence. But we said, Essence already exists. You know, we want to do something different. And the magazine was the subscription rate was out of this world. You know, but simply we could not interest the advertising agent, the advertising world to support us. So finally, after 2.5 years of pouring their savings into this magazine that continued to lose money, everybody decided it was time to drop this wonderful habit that was too expensive. So I was caught in a quandary. I had interrupted a career in Nigeria, rather promising career as a magazine editor, to come here and be the founding editor of Ndibe's magazine. So what was I to do? One option was to go back to Nigeria. The other option, of course, was to stay back in this country. But stay back and do what? I didn't know. So one day I ran into John Edgar Whiteman. Who knows of John Edgar Whiteman's writing? Brilliant. John Edgar Whiteman is one of the most brilliant writers this country has ever produced. He's a very sophisticated, difficult, challenging writer. But you are rewarded if you read John Edgar Whiteman. And his insights into American history and the way that he uses these insights in his fiction and in his non-fictional writings are just extraordinary. So John Edgar Whiteman happened to be one of the magazine's editors. So one day he said to me, he ran into me and said, so what's your plan? What are you planning to do? I said to him, I haven't figured it out. And he looked me in the face and he said, you are writing a novel, right? Well, I wasn't writing a novel. But the way he asked the question, I felt that it was imperative that the answer be yes. I felt if I had said no, then he would not talk to me ever again in life. So I said, yes, I am. So he asked me to get him the following week 15 to 20 pages of this manuscript. He said, I'll see if I can help get you a fellowship to do your MFA at UMass, where he was a professor at the time. So that weekend, I wrote furiously, without knowing at all whether what I was writing resembled fiction. But I had to produce something. And for me, the moral of this, so when I gave him 23 pages of this manuscript that I produced the following week, Edgar Whiteman read it and not only praised it, but said that it reminded him of the writing of the Kenyan novelist Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Ngugi wa Thiong'o is at UC Irvine now, and his name has been mentioned in the last 5 years as a top contender for the Nobel Prize in Literature. And he's an extraordinary writer. And so for my work, which for me was very amateurish at the time, to be spoken of in the same breath as Ngugi wa Thiong'o's work was an extraordinary boast. But I was lucky, finally, that John Edgar Whiteman was able to get me into UMass to study fiction. So I tell students that there are several morals of this story. One is that you don't know, really, a lot of times we don't know that we know what we think we don't know. Does it make sense? Let me find another way of phrasing it. A lot of times we know more than we are aware that we know. I didn't know that I could write a novel until I acceded to a lie and had to live up to it. See? So it becomes for me a very important pedagogical mindset to bring into the classroom. Because in the classroom you find students who are extraordinary storytellers and who have an extraordinary insight into novels and poetry and so on. But a lot of times they don't know that they have this ability. So when you say to them, you're going to write a story, they say, what am I going to write about? I don't know how to do it. So I say, do it. I say, do it. Pretend that you've lied to me that you're a great writer. Go and live up. Go and bring that lie, right? Let that lie true. So another moral of the story, therefore, is lie. Especially if it is a creative lie. Especially if it is a lie that is then going to bring you to a commitment to creativity. Lie like hell. Lie. And I was lucky as a student at UMass. So one day I took a class with a man who was in his 80s called Tamax Axel, A-C-Z-E-L. He was an old Hungarian writer who won the Lenin Prize, sort of the Nobel Prize of the Communist World. He broke with communism and relocated to London, lived in London for some years and then came to the US. So he was on the faculty of the MFA at UMass at the time. So I took a workshop with him. And it was the most fun workshop because we met at the Lord Jeff restaurant. And he will buy everybody a drink. If you wanted to eat food, you pay for yourself. If you wanted a glass of wine or beer, it was on. So this man was about 81, 82 at the time. And he walked to the stage. And so we will be drinking and discussing our stories. Then, the day the class discussed my story, Master Excel did not say one word. And it was a moment of great fear for me. I said, wow, this man has not said a word about my story. So at the end of class, he said to me, okay. He said, come to see me in my office tomorrow. I said, wow, this man wants to tell me he doesn't have even a prayer of success as a writer, so just quit, stop, right? And I felt that he wanted to tell me this in his office because he didn't want to publicly out me as an incompetent writer. So the next day, very timidly, I knocked on his door. And he said, come in. And I went in, and he was writing something in longhand. And he looked at me, and he said to me, okay, sit down. He had this kind of magisterial, declarative voice. Sit down. So I sat down. And he had his glasses at the top of his nose, and he kept writing for a while. Then he looked up at me several minutes later, and he said to me, do you know why I asked you to come see me? Well, I knew. I knew that I had disappointed him in the chapter of what became my first novel that I had submitted. I knew, therefore, that he called me to say, look, your writing is going nowhere, so consider finding a different thing to do with your life. But I didn't want to expose myself to engage in that form of self-flagellation by saying to him, yes, I knew my writing is terrible. So I said to him, no, I don't know why you called me. Master Sell then said to me, of all the stories we've read in class so far, yours is the only one that has a promise of being published as a book. So I've asked you to come to my office so that you will make me a promise that you will keep writing it until it becomes a book. Do you promise? He asked. I said, yes, sir, I do. And he said, of course you would, otherwise I'll kick your ass. So here is a man who was in his 80s, and the mental picture that I then had was of the committee of 2 or 3 that it would take to raise his legs to kick my ass. So that book, because of the encouragement I got from him and from John Edgar Whiteman and from everybody, became my first novel, Arrows of Rain. And I'm going to speak for another 2 minutes, which means 4 minutes, really, about Arrows of Rain. And then I'm going to pause. If you don't have questions, then I'll resume and speak about Foreign God's Name. If you have questions, then we'll segue into questions and answers. But I came to this country having read widely. I've been very fortunate, and I think that in the end, that was why I was able to write the novel at all. That I had immersed myself in literature from different traditions and cultures and times, so that I had inhered, if you like, the mechanics of putting a novel together without knowing that I knew that, until I acceded to this line, you're working on the novel, right, and I had to show it. So, but when I sat down to write, I was intrigued, fascinated by the idea of silence and power, the nexus between silence and power. And that fascination came from a while ago when I was in high school, that I read the prison memoir of a Nigerian writer, Wole Soyinka, who became the first black person to win the Nobel Prize for Intellectual Achievement. So in 1986, the Nobel Committee gave him the Nobel Prize for Literature. Wole Soyinka has been an activist writer all his life, even today. And so in the mid-60s in Nigeria, as Nigeria hustled its way to war, civil war, called the Biafran War. I'm sure some of you know about that war. Soyinka was both upset at the genocide of the Igbo people, which is my part of the country, but also he rejected the response of secession by people from my area of Nigeria. So Soyinka traveled both in the US as well as in Europe, trying to persuade these powers, the European and American powers, not to sell weaponry to either side. He returned to Nigeria, and the government arrested him and put him in detention for 24 months, much of it in solitary confinement. In confinement, he began to work on his prison memoirs, writing on tissue paper, toilet papers, and the foil of cigarette packets. So when he came out of jail, he wrote this book, released this prison memoirs called The Man Died. And in that book, there's a line that haunted me the first time I read it, that still haunts me every time I read that book. And that line goes, "The man dies in all who keeps silent in the face of tyranny." The man dies in all, and I'll say the woman dies in all as well, who keeps silent in the face of tyranny. Years later, after I came to this country, for the first time, I was lucky to stumble on the drama Antigone by Sophocles, the ancient Greek dramatist. And Antigone tells the story of a young woman who defies a king who has decreed that her brother, who has died whilst leading a foreign invasion force against his own city, and dies in the attempt, the king decrees as a punishment that young man must not be buried, but that his remains, his cadaver, should be left to the elements to be picked at by vultures and carrion. But the sister, Antigone, says no, that she owed filial duty to her brother to give him proper burial. And during her trial before the king, she says that what she did is consistent with her duty, filial duty. That what she did is also consistent with what the gods would want her to do. But finally, and for me, most powerfully, she argues that most members of their community are on her side, admire her defiance of the king's decree. But, so I said to myself once I read it, how come nobody speaks up from within the community to say to the king, King Creole, we agree with what the young woman did. Silence, moral cowardice in the face of power. So those subjects interested me. And so my novel looks at a journalist who fails to do his job of telling a story that is his moral responsibility to tell. So I'm fascinated by the subject of people remaining silent when speech is imperative. Okay? And so my favorite line in that novel comes from the grandmother of this journalist, who tells him in the early days of his journalism that a story that must be told never forgives silence. A story that must be told never forgives silence. And so when I teach a class, I tell my students that I'm not a huge fan of stickers that are put on cards. But there was one sticker that I saw and it took my breath away. That sticker said, speak, even if your voice shakes. Speak, even if your voice shakes. And once I read it, in my mind I said, especially then. When you're in a situation and your voice is shaking, I think that that is when, above all or everything, you know that you bear responsibility for speaking. And so this has informed my practice. I write a weekly column for a Nigerian newspaper. I've written it since 1999. And because I speak, because I chose to speak, the Nigerian government in 2011 put my name as an enemy of the state. So whenever I show up in Nigeria, I'm arrested at the airport and detained for anything between 2 hours and 10 hours. And this is an attempt to intimidate me into silence, into not telling the stories that I feel a compulsion to tell. But I also tell audiences in Nigeria that fear is a choice. And I've chosen not to fear. Thank you very much. So we can take questions. There's Michael. Is Michael still in the room? Michael? Yeah, Michael, ask a question. Yeah. I'm sorry, if you don't have a question yet, we'll come back to you. But think of one. Okay. Mike and I were talking outside, and I told him we must ask a question. Yes, I do that to my students. Okay. So, questions, or I'll take suggestions for editing my books. Yes.
So specifically about writing. Such a challenge.
Can you hear her?
No.
Okay. Is it okay if you stood up and projected your voice? Okay? Right? Is your voice shaking a bit? That makes 2 of us. Yeah? You want to borrow this, actually.
So finding the story in the story as a writer is such a challenge. Just when I was working on fiction, that was the hardest part, and then I was doing poetry, which in some ways was more natural to me, but still to really have a broad impact. There's some kind of story there that people relate to, and now I'm doing fiction, and I still feel like we're starting at the beginning. I'm finding the story in the story. You told your stories, it was you and your talk, and there's just nothing extraneous there. It's all points towards your end, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about how to get there.
That's a brilliant professorial writerly question. One of the things that I do with my students is to pose that question: where do stories come from? Okay, where do stories come from? It's part of what I couldn't buy was that I thought that writing was such a mysterious thing, and that writers sort of in my culture, when you read a lot of books, there are stories that your brain could just explode one day from all the knowledge, all the books that you've read, right? So actually parents will say to their children who read a lot, you've got to pause and give them the brain to write. So I felt that writers were that kind of people that they've read too much, they are just on the cusp of their brains exploding, and that's where they got all these ideas. But no, stories were surrounded by stories everywhere, literally. Okay, we're surrounded by stories. We are immersed in them. The very air is rife, complete with stories. Okay, so, and I think that a lot of times the problem that writers have when they wonder, where is this story going to come from, is not a failure of the imagination, but often a predicament with dealing with just the sheer richness, plenty of possibilities that are available to you. So which one is urgent? And I think that finally, it's a matter of listening to, it's a wayside mystical process in it, but listening to that voice within you that says, this one is, of all the options that you have, this one is the one that you must tell now. Okay? And I remember reading an interview by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who died, I think, last year, the great Colombian novelist who wrote 100 Years of Solitude. So years ago, he gave an interview, and he talked about what he does when he feels a compulsion to write a story. And he said, because he recognizes the rigor, the commitment, the pain of that process, the solitariness of that process, that he finds every excuse not to sit down and write a story. So he says he goes to cafes every day and sits down with his friends and drinks and yarns and so on. He takes long vacations with his wife. He said this. But he says that after a while, the story becomes so demanding, so compelling. This is as if the story gathers him and puts him down in his chair. And he says he writes feverishly until he finishes the book. And then when he finishes, he feels that there's a hole in his head where the story had laid. See? Now, I think that what happens is that we have so many stories in our sensibility, seeking an outlet. Okay? Like today, I could, if I started back, I would tell different stories. I never prepare what I'm going to say because I have too many stories to tell. So I go with the spirit and how it moves me. So when I told you the first Okey story, I could have told you of my arrest for bank robbery 10 days after I came to this country. That's my favorite go-to story. But I decided to tell you about my name. And once I told it, and Rebecca was so titillated by that story, I said, let me tell the other Okey story. I didn't want to do that. See? Yeah. So I think that in the end, there's also the question of form. So you said you write poetry and you write fiction. And there are things that come to me and I say, this is best revealed in the poetic form. This is best revealed in fiction. This is best revealed. And there are flakes of myself, stakings of myself that find their way into my fiction. Okay? So there are events that I've lived that I then transform and make part of my fiction. Some of those events, again, come up in the essays that I write. So it depends on the form that I want to look at any given time. It also depends on what particular story I'm most passionate about telling. And then that will, of course, again, once you make that decision, then that will shape the form in which you tell it. But the creative process is a very involved, very complex process. You have to be patient, and sometimes you let it come to you, and sometimes you let the story guide you to dictate its contours and its trajectory and so on and so forth. I know it's a very incompetent way of answering your very brilliant question, but that's my answer. Yes, yes, sir. If you could stand and tell your story to the entire room.
What is it that you like about characters, and what is it that made your characters important to you?
Okay, good. What I like about characters in fiction, I take it, right? Characters in fiction.
Or in,
Say?
or in non-fiction.
Or in non-fiction.
Or in any
Okay,
stories.
so we're all characters, all of us, right? And we are infinitely interesting characters. Any character you take, I mean, the writers actually invent sort of one-dimensional, shallow characters, but that's an invention. Every human being who is seemingly one-dimensional is merely seemingly one-dimensional. As humans, we have great capacity for complexity. Okay? So I love that I could talk to Rebecca, right? If we had 5 minutes to spend together, I'm going to hear and understand great things about you, right? Of course. And that goes for everybody in this room, right? So a writer, I tell my students, as a writer, you must be attentive to the drama going on around you. You must be attentive. People are very complex beings. They're endlessly interesting. Okay? So that's what I like about characters. That's what some people, it's, again, like when I was a graduate student, some of my fellow students will complain about the law professor is boring. But I found the professor endlessly entertaining, endlessly interesting. Simply, each of us has a different way of telling our stories. Okay? And so what I do is to enter empathetically into the terms that you have decided for the telling of your own story, right? So there are professors who sit down through the class. There are professors who walk around, and I find all of them very interesting, and all the material, right? So I would say that complexity, that gift that we have as humans for being interested is what makes me interested in human beings and interested in characters in fiction as well as non-fiction. Yes, sir.
So in that case, would you put like the character like in the trial, like kind of like, I'm not sure where I'm going, but
Which is a good way of telling a story. I love it when somebody says, I'm not sure of what I'm trying to say. It makes it interesting for me, right? It makes it interesting. Now there are people who know exactly what they're trying to say, right? And they're interested in their own way. So let's wrestle with it a little more.
Oh, is this the trial of the hypothetical? So the teacher is sitting down nervously. You try to make a story. Like, is that when you're talking to you try to make a story out of why he's nervous, what happened before he takes the class? So that's the process of character.
Well, yeah. So let's say that a teacher walks into class, right, and seems not to have it together, right? And I look at this teacher. Maybe that's the form of that teacher. I used to be that kind of teacher. In the early days of my career, I was foolish. I used to think that the classroom, that the teacher in the classroom was like a rock star who had to impress the heck out of the students. All right? So, and of course, the teacher is not a rock star, but every day I walk into the classroom wondering, do I have enough to impress my students today, to keep them entertained as they are learning? But of course, I've given up that illusion. I'm a rock star. Right? So all I need to do is to get into the classroom and sort of provoke my students to learn. And in the process of learning, even when they don't know it, to learn from them. So I finally figured out that the good teacher learns from his students every day. But, so there are all kinds of things that happen to us. So what I do as a writer, if somebody looks disorganized in class, I begin to offer this person as a character a kind of interiority. I begin to imagine the person's life. And I imagine from what I know. I'll tell you a quick example, right? So sometimes when I teach a class, I decide there are several novels that I want to read that I haven't found time to read, so I'm going to teach those books so that I'll read them. But a lot of times, life gets in the way, right? You want to go to class, your son has a fever, you go to the doctors, and from there you take another one to sport, and so you haven't read the book you're going to teach, and your students have read. So I walk into class, so what am I going to do? I'm not going to say to the students, I haven't read this novel, I haven't finished it. So when I walk in, I come with a game. I tell the students, we've ended the previous novel, so we're going to start this one. But I was thinking about it, and it struck me that there is so much more that we haven't quite addressed in the previous novel. So we're going to spend today's class going back to that novel. I get out of a jam. Because if I say we're going to read this novel, I haven't read it. I haven't finished. So students are going to ask me a question about something that happened in the end. Or sometimes if I'm toward the end, I'll say to students, okay, we're going to start this book. And I say, we're going to look at the first half of the book. And there's always a student who says, I'm intrigued by what happened at the end. I said, no, I'm not going to discuss that today. There's some program that's going to be for the next class, right? So I think because I do that kind of game, when a professor, I was a student and a professor did that, I was like, he probably hasn't finished. And so, right? Yeah. Yes?
What similarities do you find between the oral traditions of Nigeria and the complexity of writing a full novel here?
Thank you very much. Because he asked that question, that's actually something I wanted to speak to. When I sat down to write, I suddenly realized that my oral tradition, that in the narrative tradition, in the folktales that I learned, that there were already all the elements of fiction, not quite to the same degree, but they were already all there, right? So the story I told you about Tortoise takes place, has a setting, has characters. Tortoise is an infinitely interesting character, has dialogue, right? Has dramatic tension. But I didn't know that. I used to say, wow, this is folktales, and this is fiction. This is ordinary and almost base, and this is sophisticated and powerful, right? But no, I began to see connections between the two forms. Of course, every form has its own stipulations. So you don't do excessive character development in folktales, right? In my traditional folktales, the tortoise already has a form. Everybody, anytime my parents said, tortoise in the story, we knew the tortoise was wily, was cunning, would try to pull off some tricks and so on and so forth. And also we knew that the tortoise is often caught in the jams, in his own contradictions, you see. So there's already a given. Now that given is often not there in a novel, except of course if somebody is dealing with, say, politicians, and they evoke a certain kind of response in us, you know. So they say politicians, then you say, oh, corrupt, you know. That's all, especially if it's a politician from a country like mine, where it's reprobate, reprehensible fools who find their way into politics. But already those elements are there. Those elements in fiction are already there. That's what I discovered when I began to write. They're already there in the folktales. Mike, are you ready now? Not yet. No pressure. Let's go to somebody. But I'm going to come to you before the interview is over. Yeah. Yes. Could you? Yes.
Well, basically, I kind of write fiction as a hobby, and I kind of had a question regarding storytelling. What do you think are important notes and most important points to make it in a story?
Yes. Well, I think the writer, what's the most important way to make a story entertaining, right? It's important to know that all of us have our stories. All of us carry stories. That's part of what makes us human, is that inherent capacity for storytelling, for making stories, right? Now, but there are better storytellers than other ones, right? So some people almost kill their stories, I remember that the student I knew who come and complain in my office that people don't want to listen to my stories. They don't want to hear my stories. And I said to him, it's because you tell the stories as if you're not invested in the stories. You don't bring passion to the stories. I said, if you bring my story, he said, when I'm talking with my friends, I'll say something that they will drop it. Somebody else will say the same thing and they will go with it. I said, look, if you're discussing basketball, you say, LeBron James is a great basketball player. Nobody wants it down. You've said something that young kids are interested in, right? But the guy who said, wow, did you see LeBron last night? The guy was nasty. That's what everybody said, whoa, what did he do, right? So they respond to you. So, in addition to the material that you have to deal with, the style of delivery is important. And in the culture, people like the performer. Right? In human cultures, people like the performer. And therefore, one of the ways in which performance is particularly underscored is a writer's capacity for humor, especially when you're dealing with dark material, which is sort of my compulsion is to go for the dark, to look at power and silence, but to look at them in such a way that when you are immersed in it, because you feel that this is just bleak, unless you are dying with laughter as you read it. And so when Goody Wathiongo read my novel and woke me up one morning, I said, call me from California at 6 a.m. his time. So I said, Walimu, I called him teacher, Walimu. He said, don't you sleep. He said, I was up all night reading your book. And he said, I love it. And he said, a lot of times I had to laugh so as not to cry. There's a story of a young man who's had a fantastic liberal arts education at Amherst College, degree in economics, who expects that he's going to get a job in the corporate world. But his accent, the thickness of his accent, undermines this effort. So in interview after interview, he's rejected because he can't quite enunciate the way Americans would understand it. And so he succumbs to the ultimate gamble of his life. He's become a gambler. And he decides to go back to his community to steal a war god, what used to be a god of war for his people, to sell it to a gallery in New York that buys and sells foreign sacred objects poached from different parts of the world. That story and the treachery of it, and the fact that this young man betrays his uncle, who is the custodian of this deity, is something that should rile people up. And it's extremely funny through the way. So I make it funny as a way I say to people that for me, storytelling, as well as fiction, is an act of seduction. Yeah? So you want a reader to start reading this work and be so seduced that they are lost in it until they are finished. And then the story stays with them if it is strong enough, if it is significant enough. It stays with them, as good literature does, because you're reflecting on all these dramas and ultimately holds up a mirror to yourself. You say, if I were in this guy's position, would I have acted different? Thank you. Michael, ready?
Yeah.
Michael is ready now. Michael, go.
What else motivates you to speak and to keep going?
Michael says, what else motivates me to keep going, to keep speaking in the face of tyranny? Because tyranny, for me, if you understand tyranny, then you would understand how pernicious it is, how inimical what makes us profoundly human it is. And therefore, and part of what I tell students, when I speak in Nigeria, students don't believe it when they announce that I'll show up, and I show up. They say, wow, we thought that you would be scared of assassination. Nigeria has a history of assassination of journalists and of writers, the hanging of writers. But I say to them that finally for me, silence in the face of a story that I think must be told, silence will kill me. If I'm forced to be silent, I'll die. So I might as well, if I must die, be killed for speaking up. So I speak and I write when I feel that the situation demands speech, demands of me as a citizen that I don't betray Antigone by remaining silent in the face of this powerful king who's taking a very terrible decision. Okay? And so the democratic impulse, the enlargement of the democratic space, for me, becomes possible only when enlightened and informed citizens make a commitment to have a voice in the way that their affairs are run. So for me, that's really what mandates that I speak. Thank you very much for coming up with a wonderful question. Yes?
Now, you not only have the government of Nigeria that's crazy, you also do the Boko Haram.
Yes.
How has that impacted your writing and what you're able to publish in the country?
Okay. Well, I've written a lot on Boko Haram. In fact, I'm sure all of you know about the 300 girls, more than 300 girls that were abducted by Boko Haram. Most of them still missing. That tragic event happened on April 14, the night of April 14 last year. Earlier in the day, bombs went off at a crowded bus station that killed close to 200 people. Car bombs. As happens in Nigeria, the media reported that 170 to 200 plus people had perished in this series of car bombs. And the Nigerian government issued a statement saying only 30 people died. And it riles me, galls me, that the government will call the dead even. First of all, the government will want to reduce, sort of offer us again narratives, right? Offer us a different, falsified narrative. Nearly 200 people died. The government says, we want to reduce the number, so we're going to say only 30. And we're going to qualify by saying only, as if these are ants, not humans. So if it's only 30, then it's fine. We can move on. We're a population of 170 million people. That same night, these girls are abducted from their high school where they are waiting to take exams the next day. The very next day, after these horrific events, the Nigerian president is named Goodluck Jonathan, goes to Kano, another Nigerian city, to do a political rally, as if nothing happened. And at that political rally, there's a musician playing and the president is dancing, as if the killing and the abduction of his citizens is the acme of political success. But I was particularly maddened that 3 weeks after the kids were killed, were abducted, there was nobody in Nigeria, no official or no reporter who could tell you how many students have been picked up. So some newspapers were saying 103, some were saying 336, some were saying 276, some were saying 200 and something. And so I wrote a piece for an online journal in Amsterdam called This Is Africa, .de. And I entitled that piece, Life and Death in a Country That Doesn't Count. But I meant it. This is a country that can't even that in a country that can't count, is a country that can't even count the number of its children who are abducted. And so I said, if you don't know how many of your school children have been abducted, how are you going to know if you found them all? So that piece was picked up by the Guardian of London and republished, and it went viral. And that's what exploded all this hashtag Bring Back Our Girls. It was after my piece came out. And within the span of 24 hours, I did about 12 BBC interviews, Australian television, and all of them. So I was in demand to speak. So Boko Haram has become to everybody, because Nigeria is particularly a tragic country in a particular way. Nigeria has always told itself a narrative of it can't happen here. So when certain kinds of dictators were sprouted in different parts of Africa, Nigerians would say, such a dictator will not come here. And then that dictator will come back. When the Islamist terrorists began to seize the world, and the people incinerating themselves, blowing themselves up in order to kill other people, Nigerians said, no Nigerian will be a suicide bomber. We will plant bombs, but we're not going to be the bombs ourselves. That has come to Nigeria. So Nigerians don't quite believe that there will be a group like Boko Haram that is highly organized, that has strategic intelligence, that has infiltrated the Nigerian government at the highest levels. That even soldiers now believe that their commanding officers are often embedded with Boko Haram because they are sent on missions and Boko Haram ambushes them and kills them. Which is why when Boko Haram comes, soldiers run. That's why they continue to seize territories. The soldiers don't have access to Boko Haram. They believe it's their commanding officers. And the narrative is being told, which elsewhere in the world you say this is not believable. But some people believe that the Nigerian military has chosen not to take up Boko Haram and resolve the challenge that they pose, because as long as Boko Haram remains a problem, then the security budget of the country will continue to rise, and then military officers in Nigeria will find what to steal. It is a sort of explanation that will be nonsensical elsewhere in the world, except that in Nigeria, as a friend of mine who is an attorney says, Nigeria is a country where absurdity makes sense. And so I write about this painfully. I write about it. It's very painful. But I have to write about it. Because it's my duty to. Yeah.
So it's very clear that you have people who don't like your writing, people who do like your writing. And on my past English possibilities, think of who your audience is, who you know your audience is when you're writing.
Good. Clearly, government officials don't like my writing. Okay? They don't like my writing. But in a perverse way, I have them in mind when I write. My primary audience are the Nigerians who are the victims of their villainy, the victims of their perfidy. Okay? But government officials also read me and respond to me in different ways. Some of them respond to me by offering bribes, right? They think, what does this guy want? I will silence him. So I've been offered jobs in government. I've been offered huge bribes. And it baffles them because a lot of Nigerian journalists would take quickly. So you have columnists who have become wealthy, who then go into government as ministers and commissioners and presidential aides and as aides to governors, but they can't quite figure me out. As I say, my gifts that I've been given are in two directions. At least the gifts that I'm aware of and that I most cherish, not to be a teacher, but to be a writer. I have absolutely no ambitions in any other direction. So if somebody said to me, start a business tomorrow and you become the wealthiest man in the world, I don't want to start a business. If you said to me, write this kind of novel and it will bring you fame and so on, that's what interests me. And so my audience is primarily the victims of these contemptible fools in government who measure their achievement in terms of how much they're able to loot of public resources. Unfortunately, Nigeria has been so damaged mentally that you won't believe the kind of, that the best defenders of corrupt government officials are their victims. So Nigerians will talk about a governor who pays salaries as an achievement. They say, this man, the previous governor owed salaries for 12 months, and you won't believe it, but there are governors in Nigeria, as we speak, who haven't paid their civil servants, state employees, for 12 months. And the governor is flying all over the world, has houses all over the world. So when you have a governor who comes in and begins to pay salaries regularly, Nigerians know he's a man of great achievement. He pays salaries. He has constructed so many kilometers of roads, and they speak about this as an achievement. And so when I come out and I say, this is not an achievement, some people attack me and say, this is, it's because you live in America, so you are measuring us by American standards. This is an achievement in Nigeria. And I said to them, Nigerian officials are some of the highest paid government officials anywhere in the world. There's something called security vote in Nigeria. Security vote. The CIA has a covert budget because of the nature of their operations around the world. So they don't explain to us how they spend the money, except to a select committee of Congress that they occasionally count, swung to high levels of secrecy. So Nigeria has a way of borrowing a good or a bad idea, a different idea, and make it into a crime manufacturing conceit. So Nigerians said, because the CIA has a covert budget, we're going to create what we call security vote, which is going to be for covert security operations. And instead of giving the budget to an institution like the CIA, they give it to governors and the president. And every Nigerian governor has at least 300 million naira, which is like $2.4 million every month in security budget. And you can't ask questions because it's for security. No questions asked. And so it's understood that governors take that money every month and they pocket it. When you say, how did you spend the security money? It's on security. So you become a security threat when you ask those questions. So I raise these questions and I say, we have governors in Nigeria who are paid every month or who are able to steal every month as much as 7 or more times Obama's annual salary. And yet, when you demand that they do more than pay salaries, some people come after you and they say you are comparing America to Nigeria. And I say, why not? These governors are paid a lot more than the Nigerian president. So why can't we then demand a lot more from them? Why should I settle for a governor saying he built 50 kilometers of roads, which are substandard to begin with? The first rainfall washes the roads away. When people say to you, there's a governor in the past who never even built any. So let's praise this man for building substandard roads. So I have fights on all kinds of fronts, but I'm engaged in the work of raising awareness, of enlightening people. So I have to be patient, and ultimately, I have affected public discourse in Nigeria. Nigerian officials used to rig elections. Okay, when they rig elections, so you see somebody who won 10% of the vote, but he bribes the electoral commission, and they announce that he won 90%. And the next thing they will say is, it's only God that gives power, so God has given me power. And Nigerians who have this false sense of piety believe it. Okay? So I was teaching as a Fulbright scholar in a Nigerian university, and I began to use Chinua Achebe's novel, A Man of the People, to talk about political, electoral fraud. And one student raised his hand and said, sir, you can't condemn somebody who wins by rigging because it's God who gives power. So if somebody wins by rigging, it means God has permitted him to win. And I asked the class, I said, how many of you believe this narrative? And about 80% of the class raised their hands. So I gave them a simple example. I said, there's an election between candidate A and B. A won the popular vote. B bribed the electoral officials and is declared the winner. Did God give power to B? They raised their hands, and I called one of them. He said, yeah, God wanted candidate B to win by fraud. Because if God didn't want it, God would have killed it. It's a university class, and this is a quality of wisdom. And the thing that, so anything where you invoke God in Nigeria, it becomes fun. So politicians now steal public funds, they build themselves mansions, and they write, to God be the glory. And people say, oh, he's a man of God. He lives in God. So you can't criticize him. He's giving God credit. I said, no, God cannot participate in fraud and in evil. So because I have constantly questioned, called that kind of deceptive language, deceptive rhetoric into question, politicians have withdrawn from now rigging elections and saying, it's God that has given me power. Because I have said to people, no, God cannot participate in fraud. So my audience is basically as elastic as possible, including the idiots that I take on week after week. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
So these folk tales that you grew up listening to that were embedded this reality in you, are those same students that you're teaching all these languages? Are they growing up with the same?
No. Okay, the folk tales that I grew up. By the way, it's not just folk tales that shape my morality. Finally, I go back to my parents. My parents shaped us, 5 of us, right? The folk tales, I said, in traditional society were part of the primary because you didn't have formal school systems in traditional society. So folk tales, the telling of folk tales to kids became a way that you shape their moral outlook, right? No, the television is the going form of dissemination of any information or values today, and the internet, just like globally. And so folk tales are no longer told much. In fact, a few years ago, I was teaching at a college, Simon's Rock College in Great Barrington, and I decided that the college encouraged their faculty to teach interesting new courses. So I said, let me teach a course in African folk tales. Then I went home and said to my mom, tell me some of the folk tales you used to tell me. My mom said, I've forgotten them. And she said, go to this other woman or go to this other man. And everybody said, I have forgotten. Because it's been years and years, decades since they last had the habit of sitting down to tell the children the folk tales. So I was lucky that I remembered some. And I actually began to tell my children the stories that I remembered when they were born. And I was surprised because at night, after dinner, my wife and I will give them the option of watching TV for 30 minutes before you went to bed or hearing a folk tale. And 100% of the time they would choose to be told a folk tale by me. They just found them enchanting. And my son, my older son, was a particularly tough, difficult customer who said to me, Dad, I want you to tell me a story, a folk tale that will have a snake and an elephant, and I want them to fight and I want the snake to win. So he said the parameters of the story and I had to deal with the problem. What was my life like growing up in Nigeria? As a child, first of all, I was very, very fortunate to have extraordinary parents. My father is late now, and the man that I most admire in life. So his memory fuels me. My mother is going to be 90 in April, and she's a very strong woman. My mother, I was home in Nigeria in December, giving a reading, and they surprised me in my home state, and they surprised me by bringing my mother to introduce me. My mother told the crowd how I used to be a difficult child and she used the cane to cane sense into me. So in America, the police would have arrested her immediately. So I told her mom when it came time to talk, I said, now I'm going to sue you for child abuse. And my mom began to quote the Bible. She said, the Bible says, spare the rod and spoil the child. So I told her that American judges don't read the Bible. So you are in trouble. But I'm grateful to my parents that they came me. Okay, I'm really grateful. And I was a very difficult child, guys. Very difficult. And so my parents gave us great, privileged moral formation, all five of us. And I thought I was in hell because I grew up poor. I remember that constantly we would finish eating, not have enough food, and my mom would say, did you have enough? I'll say, no, mom, thinking that she would serve us more. She would say, go drink more water. That was it, right? Soda, for example. In a year, if I was lucky, I'll have 2 bottles of soda. 2 bottles in a year. And so I craved sweet soda. And when I left the house and started working, I would drink with that Coca-Cola with every meal. And then after a while, it began to taste just awfully sweet in my mouth. So I no longer eat sweet things at all, not for any health reason. It's just that they are too sweet, so I don't eat cake. Unless my favorite daughter insists on her birthday, then I'll take a tiny little piece. I don't eat, yeah. You like your cake, yes. So I have a favorite daughter, my only daughter, and 2 sons. But I grew up with great privilege in terms of the moral example that my parents gave us. And so a politician who tried to bribe me actually sent a cousin of mine to my mother. My cousin went and said, okay, stupid, this guy wants to give him close to $1 million. Okay, it's just refusing the money. And he expected that my mother would say, oh, I'm going to talk sense into him. I'm going to force him to take the money. And my mother said, no, okay, tells me these things. And he says, my late husband and I gave good moral training to our kids. And so my son will never touch sneezy money. And so that was the end of that. And so, but when I was growing up, I didn't appreciate it. I actually wanted my parents to cut corners because I saw other parents who cut corners, who had more money and provided more for their children. And I thought this was the way to go. But now I look back and I say to my parents, thank you for the gift that you've given to us. Yeah. So you tell me, because I'm ready to go all day.
I'm getting an impression. I think we can keep it.
Yes, I'm loving it. But somebody has a question there.
Okay. Let's do one more question, and then if people want to purchase your books.
Read it. I'm sorry. Okay. Please. No. You raise your hand first.
Writer that you admire, or
is there any writer that I admire?
Yeah, or inspire you?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. In my presentation, I spoke about Chinua Achebe who wrote Things Fall Apart, was the writer that I first really fell in love with. Chinua Achebe. Wole Soyinka, who went to jail, was in prison during the Nigerian Civil War, is another writer, and I'm lucky to count him as a champion of my work. I love Ngugi wa Thiong'o. I love Faulkner. I love the writings of James Baldwin and Toni Morrison and Sophocles, and I like Gilgamesh. So I like Shakespeare, of course. So I'm eclectic in my influences and in the writers that I really admire. We're going to sneak in one more question. You. Last.
Are you familiar with any of the folk surrounding Anansi the spider?
Say? Anansi. Precisely, Anansi. She says, am I familiar with any of the folk tales surrounding Anansi the spider? Yes. The Anansi is from the Ghanaian tradition. In Nigeria, the tortoise is actually the sort of the stand-in for Anansi, the trickster character in Ghanaian folktales. So yes, and I have great Anansi stories, but we're out of time. Thank you very much.
Okay,
Thanks.
keep your voice strong. Okay.
Thank you.
Or even if it is weak, just have that voice.
Exactly.
All right.
Thank
Take
you.
care.